Okay, I think that's enough time for us to get started. First off, good afternoon and welcome to our second MadeTech Talks webinar, Avoiding the Legacy Trap, How to Ensure Your Legacy Decisions Aren't Holding Back Your Modernization. Our speaker today is our very own lead engineer, Tito Sarianandia. Now, before I hand over to Tito, I just want to run through how today's going to go. Tito is going to begin with a 45-minute presentation when I hand over, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. So please make use of the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen, and we'll endeavor to answer as many of your questions at the end as possible. After the webinar, we will be sending out feedback forms to all of our attendees. It takes about 1 minute to fill out, and it goes a massively long way to helping us improve our future events. We'll also be sharing some information on our next MadeTech Talks webinar, as well as a little bit of info on our latest book launch coming out tomorrow, Modernising Legacy Applications in the Public Sector. Just a quick reminder, this session is being recorded and does come with subtitles. Instructions on how to get those are going to be found in our chat function. And without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my swcreen and hand over to Tito. Tito, if you want to take it away.
Thanks very much, Jack. And thanks everybody for turning out on this sweltering August day to indulge me. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so assuming my screen is visible, if not, I'm sure Jack will interrupt. Legacy. We spend a lot of time thinking about legacy at the moment, especially if you're involved somewhere in the public sector. It shapes a lot of the thinking that we can do about where our services are going and how we spend money and the kind of tasks that we get to do as digital teams. And I've seen some successful and some unsuccessful attempts at trying to tackle that problem. And so what I want to do today is to share a bit about how do you really fix legacy? By which I mean replace it with something that actually solves the problems you had in the first place. And hopefully get across to you that the answer to that question can only be partly technical. It's also a people problem. But before we talk about any of that, let's quickly dive into what even is legacy. So I started out by trying to find out what is legacy, looked it up on Google Images. That told me absolutely nothing. I got back that image there. So what else did I learn? So engineers often use this example, this definition, which is legacy code is code without automated tests. That comes from Michael Feathers. I like this, but we're thinking about more than code here, right? We're talking about systems. You know, maybe you own the code, maybe that they're just procured off the shelf systems though. And maybe we're even talking about something like networks. It's something with an unsupported tech stack. So unsupported, maybe that literally means the manufacturer doesn't support it anymore. They're not releasing security updates. Or maybe it means it doesn't fit in with your digital strategy. So you don't want to be supporting technology like this. I like this one. So it's old in a bad way, right? So there's some tech that's old, but it's fine, like the web. But this is old in a bad way. I think this is pretty important. So it's got to be something that's still meeting a critical business need. So it's something that, you know, even though it's got all these problems that we're saying that it's old in a bad way, it is still used, right? And we can't just pull the plug and expect everything to be fine.
Sorry, Tito, sorry to interrupt. We're getting a little bit of feedback from your fan over here.
Yeah, turn the fan on, sorry.
Lovely stuff.
Yeah. I like this definition as well, which is that you know when you see it, right? It's like art. It's hard to come up with an overall definition of like, what is this thing? But if you go to any organization, you say, where's your legacy? People can typically point at it. But ultimately, it's probably a political tool. And what do I mean by that? I mean that it's a label that we use to get a particular result, rather than to describe something in a strict scientific taxonomy. And this idea is usually familiar to educators. So before I worked in software, I was a school teacher, and labeling children is something you have to do as a school teacher, right? So for example, dyslexia. So dyslexia is obviously a diagnosable medical thing, but it's also a signal to unlock the right funding, the right support, the right environment, the right staff time for a student to do their best. Schools often also maintain a register of gifted and talented students. Clearly, that's not a medical term, right? But it's still a useful label to use. So legacy then is a powerful signal to the organization. It's you slap the legacy label on something, and that activates like a sort of organizational immune response. It says, we want to deal with this bit of technology differently to how we deal with the rest of our technology. And, I think often that immune response is flawed, and we'll talk about that a little bit in this presentation as well. But ultimately you're saying, treat this differently, right? We want to deal with this somehow. So why do we use the label? There's a bunch of reasons. Often we use this label because something's just too expensive to maintain. So maybe that means you're paying over the odds on license fees for something you can't change. Or maybe it means it just takes up too much of your valuable time. Or maybe it means you have to temporarily import some like super niche skills into your organization. We use the label when technology is too hard to change. When we think things would be better if we could change this in that way, but it's too hard to do, and so we're scared of doing it or we delay doing it. We use it when the risks are out of control, when something keeps breaking and stopping people from doing their jobs or landing you in the newspapers. We use it when no one wants to work on it. It's again a pretty common problem in a larger organization that's got a mixture of legacy and strategic technology, is that really hard to persuade people that this is going to be a fun challenge for them. Maybe it's not what they signed up for. We use it when it doesn't reflect the way that we want our teams to look. So in the sort of government digital services language, we often want to organize our teams to solve a whole problem for our users. That's really hard to do if this technology was built in a different paradigm. Maybe this technology was built to sit between two other pieces of technologies, or maybe it was built using a sort of front-end, back-end, strict separation methodology. And there's also this last reason, and this one's not colored in like the other ones, because I think it's not a good reason, but nonetheless, it is a reason that that I often see that people want to use this legacy label, and that's that it doesn't look good on their CV. So people are often really keen to call something legacy if, for example, they know that having Kafka on their CV is going to look better than having some sort of 20-year-old IBM Service Bus. And of course, fixing legacy is really expensive. So we know that it often takes a long time. We know that often means you need temporarily even more specialist skill sets to come into your organization. We know that transitions can go wrong, and so you end up having to do a lot of contingency planning around those transitions. So given how expensive it is to fix legacy, it better solve a lot of these problems, right? Well, actually, no. I think that we can reliably solve these two problems, that nobody wants to work on it and that it doesn't look good on our CV. But very few organizations can confidently say every piece of modernization that we do is going to result in something that's low cost, easy to change, that the risks are all managed and mitigated, and that it reflects how we want our organization to operate. These other problems are harder to solve, and that's the motivation for sharing some of these things with you today. So when you're transforming your legacy then, what are some of the levers you can pull? So by levers, I mean inputs to your delivery process. So there's quite a few. So there's obviously the tools. So is this going to be in Java, or is it going to be in Ruby? Is this going to be an off-the-shelf product or something we build ourselves? Are we going to use an Oracle database or an open source database? There's also the problems that you use as your inputs to your team, right? So are you feeding your teams problem statements like you need to build an API with these particular inputs and outputs? Or are you letting your teams solve problems in a cross-functional way by saying things like, we need this service to do better for citizens over the age of 40? There are the skills. So who do you have in your organization can you hire or can you train extra skills into your organization? There's governance. So how do you check that things are going okay? And there's leadership. So who are your leaders? What are they doing? Are they more sort of kind of command and control leaders or servant leaders? These are all the inputs to our problem. And I think this is the thing that I'm trying to persuade you to avoid. This is the unambitious modernization, where we just talk about the tech and we don't look at the rest of it. And when we do that, these boxes that are still in gray, the things that we haven't touched, that's what I'm calling our legacy decision-making. So decisions that are made in a legacy way. And I'm going to work through an example. An example is, how do you target support of a service? So what do I mean by that? So pretty common scenario in local and central government is that you're tasked with providing some sort of support to citizens. So a couple of examples that I'm familiar with. So the student loans company. So they support students through giving them loans and grants. And there's council housing. So that supports people to have an affordable, decent place to live. And if your organization is doing that kind of support somewhere, it's probably got a long history, or you might say legacy, of trying to answer that question. How do you best target your efforts? How do you target the support that you're giving? And there's a brilliant document published up in Scotland by the Scottish Legal Aid Service, where they're reviewing the legal aid system up in Scotland. And what they say is that in moving forward, there is a careful balance to be struck between simplicity, flexibility, and fairness. And I'm not going to read the whole quote out, but they've got a really great sentence there, which is they say that complexity has been driven by fairness. And I want to dig into what does that mean, because I think it's a pretty common thing that we see across governments. It's a really nice encapsulation of what we can mean by a legacy decision-making process. So after reading that report, this is what I think is happening with that particular service. So the Scottish Legal Aid Service has a goal, and that is to increase access to justice in Scotland. And, you know, naively, you might think, well, I guess to do that, you could just take everybody going through the legal system in Scotland and just give them some money, divide it by the number of people that need it. It would be super easy to administer, of course. But in reality, the problem space is way too complex to do something like that. So, for example, what if a legal action isn't in the public interest? Or what if some people need more help than others? Clearly, you know, both those things are true. And so you need to get better and better at targeting the support you offer. And you end up with a process that looks like this. So there's some sort of a theory or report or review about how you might retarget resources to increase access to justice further. That goes through some process of ideation where people think about, well, how might that interact with our current policies and how might we give citizens access to something like that? Then a decision is made. Again, in the public sector, that decision might take the form of policy. And then an edge case is produced. An edge case as in previously, this was the sort of flow. And now we've got this little sub case here where we're going to treat it a little bit differently. And you end up with a process that looks like that. But let's keep drawing on this diagram and think about what does that mean for systems? So firstly, where are your digital teams? So chances are they are here at the edge case. So the input to the team is a policy or a decision, and everything else is upstream of them. And these digital teams might be agile teams, as in they are designing, implementing, learning, iterating. But what they're learning is, how do you best implement the decisions to the left that are upstream? A lot of this is on the left, right? So all of the ethical aspects of this are to the left of the digital teams, often for good reason. There might be a democratic decision in there, like an election manifesto pledge or something. But there are absolutely operational implications snuck in on the left. So who's doing the theorizing, the ideation, and the policy? And can those people accurately predict and comprehend the totality of how complexity in your service changes when they throw you yet another edge case? And could a simpler decision now mean that the next decision is implemented faster? And put simply, that means that the people with the power to achieve that balance of simplicity, fairness, and flexibility that the review into the Scottish legal aid system suggested are all on the left. But the people with the operational knowledge to make that happen are on the right. And this is what I'd call a legacy decision-making process. And this is the result. So I think that reading that report, it sounds like there's an over-focus on fairness at the expense of the other two factors they mentioned, which are simplicity and flexibility, which leads to complication, cost, and rigidity. Strongly recommend checking out this document. It's the Independent Review of Legal Aid in Scotland from 2018. And the pipeline sort of guarantees this balance. And this is the result of that. So this is what happens when the input to your digital teams is just edge cases, just policy edge cases. I don't know if this looks familiar to anybody, but where you sort of try and draw out a problem space and you end up with a lot of systems, a lot of arrows going between them. And then you start thinking about, where do we start, right? What's the bit that we can change first? And you point somewhere and then somebody pipes up and they say, oh, no, you can't change that because there's this policy back in 2008 that says this. And then you point somewhere else and somebody else says, well, I don't know what that does, so I don't want to touch it. And then you try somewhere else. Somebody says, well, another team asked for that. I don't know what it does, but it seemed important to them. This is what happens when your input is edge cases. So if you're in a scenario like that, would this be an acceptable digital response to that review? Well, clearly not, because the decision-making process is untouched. What's the new system likely to look like if you just touch the tools? It's highly likely to have many of the problems of the old ones, of the old system. You'll probably fix some of the problems, but you certainly won't fix them all. And if you're spending that much money, that's a wasted opportunity, money or effort. So we want to talk about some techniques, right? I'm going to go through 4, but some techniques for introducing your teams to the idea that they can deeply challenge this. And so it's not all bad news, right? There's stuff you can do. And maybe hearing that process now, especially if you're working in digital, makes it feel a bit hopeless. That you think, well, so much of this is outside of my control, that even if I'm in a very senior position, what could I possibly do to change it? But actually, that's not true. There is stuff that we can do. And it's about making sure that we've got a balance of techniques in that modernization, not just techniques about thinking about our actual tech, like programming languages, databases, hosting, but also making sure that we're introducing techniques that tackle our decision-making head-on. And here's a few. It's an illustrative sample, and we're going to go through 4 of them. So the first one is hypothesis workshops. And this is a technique to figure out what's the actual point in the stuff that we're building, right? I've worked through an example here that we did at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. I see some people from there on this call. Hello. And we ran this session slightly differently. I've refined the format a bit, but I've used our outputs to illustrate it. So what do? So you take a big wall, right? And and a bunch of sticky notes. And you start by putting your goals on the right. Our goal here is to reduce the CO2 emissions from the UK housing stock. If you've got multiple goals, like more than 3, say, I'd probably consider running this session multiple times with a smaller set of goals each time. So you'll have a small set of goals on the right there, and actual goals. So I think a goal is the impact you want to have on the world, as opposed to we want a new database. And then on the left, put down the things that you know that the legacy system supports. You might call these features. Maybe that's too low level, and maybe you want to do something like journeys or services. I think you'll probably have a hunch about what works for you. And often when you start a legacy project, you're told, well, here's all the stuff that it needs to do, because this is what it's done before. And actually, none of that stuff has been validated in perhaps 10, 15, 20 years. And what this lets you do is revalidate that and talk about how you can use the the outputs from this as well. So what we're going to do then is we're going to draw the series of events between the feature on the left and the target on the right that have to happen for the thing on the left to achieve the result on the right. And we're going to be really specific here. So the point of this system is was the energy performance of buildings register. In a nutshell, what it does is it's a large register of buildings and how energy efficient those buildings are. And the sort of overall goal is to use that data to get a grip on the sort of net zero carbon emissions target in the UK. So there's a whole bunch of things that it's supported currently, and we're going to walk through a couple of them. But broadly, you can use it to find somebody to come to your house to do one of these assessments. You can use it to see what kind of assessments you've got already on your house or your commercial property. And it does quite a lot of stuff. And we were skeptical about the value of some of it. So use this to validate it. So how do you play this workshop? So we've got these events. And the events are pretty specific. So let's look at the first feature and walk through it. The first feature is that you can use it to find an assessor to get an inspection done. So you can go online and you can put in your postcode and say, I want somebody to come to my house to assess how energy efficient it is. And we thought about, well, what's the actual series of events that have to happen for us to achieve a goal based on that feature? And this is the most credible set that we came up with. And that is that I go to sell my house. That's important because in this example, that's the point where you're obliged to get one of these certificates. I know I need a certificate. I can't find any local businesses that can do my certificate. I use the service to find an assessor and get it done. Because I got it done, the data is now more complete, and that leads to better policy. And then we think about, well, how likely is that series of events? So going left to right, assuming everything to the left is true and has happened, how likely is the next event? And let's just rate them out of 5. So first up, I go to sell my house. How likely is that? Well, quite likely. People sell their houses all the time. Let's give that a 5. I know I need a certificate. So probably there's a lot of people that don't need that, but it's easily Googleable. You probably do some research before selling your house. You probably take some advice. So we'll give that like a 3 out of 5. I can't find any local businesses that can do my certificate. Now, this is the point where we thought, that's actually not that likely. And the reason it's not likely is because we just sort of used Google, looked at the yellow pages, that sort of thing. And this idea that you wouldn't find an assessor that other way is less likely. After that, you use the service to find an assessor and you get the assessment done. Well, that feels quite likely. Like if you've got contact details of an energy assessor and you called them, show up and they'll get it done. Not too complicated. And the data is more complete, leading to better policy. So yeah, I think we've got a strong hypothesis that open data around energy performance means that, for example, if you are a council trying to figure out what sort of investments you should be making into the housing stock, you've got more data to do that. And we gave them all those ratings and ended up with this. So, you know, while some of the things are likely there's this key event in the middle that has to happen, which is pretty unlikely. And that tells us something about the value of this particular piece of our work. So then moving down to see suggested improvements to my house, the bottom row there. So this time round, it was looking good right until the end. So this time round I go to sell my house, again, pretty likely. An estate agent tells me I need a certificate, again, yeah, pretty likely. I get the certificate done. Yeah, if the estate agent says you legally have to do this, you're probably going to do it. I see I can save on energy bills if I get better insulation. So I've got this certificate now, I've just paid for it. It says, if you get better insulation, you can save on your energy bills. Again, feels pretty likely. You just paid for it. You might well read it. But then are you going to pay for that insulation? Well, we thought that seemed less likely because they're about to sell their house, right? They're not going to go tearing up the walls or replacing the windows or something like that after they've already listed it in an estate agent. So this hypothesis, again, not looking the most healthy. This last one, though, actually one of the simpler things that we have on our backlog. I go to sell my house. The Gov UK advice says I might need an inspection. I use a service that helps me if I understand one. I arrange and get the inspection done, and the data is now more complete, leading to better policy. These are all likely events. And so this really simple feature we had in the legacy system is just finding out whether or not you need one or not. We learned that that's actually one of the most important things we can tell our users. And so what do we do with that? And what's that got to do with legacy? Well, the key results is that firstly, you've got this sort of like striking output, right? And if you can do this exercise with your most senior stakeholders in the room, you need them there anyway, because they're often the ones that can tell you about the probability of some of these events. They might have spent a long time thinking about this particular service, this particular area of policy. And it gives them this clearer view of what will actually happen if we neglect one of these edge cases. Think about that edge case pipeline. Before you do this, they're all kind of equally weighted. And obviously, if everything's important, then nothing's important. And it gives you this much better way to think about risk as you're doing your migration, as you're doing your modernization. You can be thinking about, well, what are the things that we truly cannot risk, right? That must come over. And what are some of the things where you think, well, that can be a learning exercise, or that could be something that we solve later if we need it at all. And without that kind of way of discussing with a more senior stakeholder what really is risky, then you're starting off with that same 20 years of edge case input to your new legacy system, and you're going to have that same problem, that under focus on simplicity. So what's our second technique? Our second technique is to think about platforms and make them into products. So if we were all in the same room, I'd say, who has a user journey that looks like this? And everyone would put their hands up. But who has a user journey that looks like this, right? You've got a user on the left there, and they're trying to do something. And to solve their problem, each of these squares is a system. To solve their problem, this is sort of what the interaction looks like. So they use one system, and then there's a giant web of handoffs between a bunch of other systems nobody really understands. And eventually they get their result back. And of course, it's actually usually worse than that, because there might be a landscape of teams on top of these systems as well. And some things are obvious here. So there's clearly too many handovers happening here. But it's worth having this bigger picture, because zooming out and modernizing any one of these systems is going to be expensive regardless of what you do. But this structure itself is going to poison your modernization efforts, right? So think about team 2 there in the bottom right. They've got no idea who is using their stuff and why. And not only do they not have access to their user, they don't have access to the team who has access to the user. So the chance of them being able to carry out a successful modernization in that context is pretty slim. So what can you do? So clearly join up teams where you can, but where you can't do that, if you can't let someone own the entire slice of solving a user's problem, and there needs to be some sort of interface, maybe the services in the bottom corner are used by another team or another user too, for example, then impose a product identity on the thing that they're building. Call it a platform and make it clear to this platform team that they've got a product, and that the customers of that product are engineering teams or digital teams, and that there's no guarantee that those teams will continue to use their product, right? So don't let them talk like a service team. Don't let them talk like a cost center. Only let them interface with the organization as if they were a product team, just happens to be an internal product. some good ways to do this. So the product in a box exercise is a really useful way of helping people get their heads around this stuff. So literally, you know, hand out some cardboard boxes and get people to draw on them and say, well, if this platform, if this was a product, how would you describe it, right? So start writing on the box, what does it do? What doesn't it do? In what sort of circumstances might you use it? Why is it valuable to use? That sort of stuff. And it's worth doing this even if the product is really, really bad to start with, right? So even if they're going to start out with the worst reviewed product in your whole organization, it's still worth doing this. And it's worth doing it because without that sort of thinking in terms of you know, who is using this and what value are they getting from it, and can we invest in that value, then this kind of integration piece in the corner of your organization is going to continue poisoning out the organization efforts around it. So let the platform team exist, give them a strong product owner, and let them start to deeply understand their customers, to deeply understand, well, why this engineering team, why haven't you moved away from us, right? So why haven't you gone and, I don't know, bought something from a commodity cloud platform or a piece of third-party software or rolled your own thing? Really start to deeply understand that customer value. And don't compel teams to use these kind of platforms that you spin out either. So if they really decide it's going to be easier for us to implement something by moving to like a competitor, like a commodity cloud platform, or doing something themselves, then, and they do that, then obviously they've actually solved your problem for you. So that's not an issue. But if they don't, you should be able to see that product improving by understanding, well, what are their needs and why do they do that for? And I want to call out government platform as a service here, because if you check out their published materials, or if you're working in government, check them out on the CrossGov Slack. So I think they are by some margin the kind of public sector's shining example of a team whose customer is engineering teams, but who are really nailing this idea of being a platform and having a product proposition. That really shines through from all of their documentation. And if you've got a similar situation, I recommend checking that out. So thirdly, how do you get there? So let's talk about Conways Law for a second. So Conways Law is that that systems in an organization will tend to follow the internal communication structure of that organization. So you often end up with the systems on the left. So your systems are communicating in this way. And then if you think about how your teams and how they communicate, that you end up with a very similar or the same diagram. Worth trying to do this in your own organization. It's often surprising how well these things track each other. And you can see how it happens, right? Because one department procures a system to help it do its job. Then automation becomes more and more important. And so now suddenly they need to communicate with the system that another department bought. And you end up with this emergent pattern of your architecture and your computer network following your organizational network. Yeah, worth giving it a go to see if you're in that situation. And this is something that I hear a lot when talking to people who are decided to do some legacy modernization, and they're a bit worried about how to start. And that's what they say, well, you know, we'd love to have teams that solve a whole problem for our users in the GDS sense, but our systems just aren't set up like that. And it implies this kind of plan, right? That you're going to fix your systems, first of all. You're going to upskill your teams or your people, and then you're going to reorganize the teams to fit those new systems. But the problem is that step one is just never going to happen, right? Because you're asking your team to fight against Conway's Law. I think it's a bit like, you know, going on a really radical diet. So, you know, maybe you can keep it up for a bit, but it takes so much energy, focus, and determination that to keep it up long term, it's going to be hard to maintain for any significant length of time. So here's what you can do instead. Switch it around. This is the inverse Conway maneuver. So invest in the skills you need, maybe hire if you have to do that, but focus your reorganizational efforts centrally on shifting the teams around before it feels like they're quite ready. And if this works right, then by Conway's Law, what those teams will end up doing is building stuff that matches the structure that you wanted anyway. And the thing that you're aiming for, which is solving a whole problem for your users, becomes an emergent property of your architecture rather than something you have to be sort of designing out from the middle. And this works really well. So I've seen this done in government a couple of times now. And, I'd say don't have blind faith in it. So I've definitely seen some agile coaches talking about as if this is going to work like magic. And clearly that's not the case. And it's definitely worth thinking about. Are there any kind of small changes, like low-hanging fruits you can make in advance just to make everyone's lives easier? And obviously it's worth thinking about, do you have the leadership in place on your teams to do this? And it's worth thinking about, how do we manage the expectation of stakeholders that, we're going to cause a little bit of chaos temporarily, and that's probably going to slow down velocity for a bit, but this is why it's worth it overall. But, with those caveats, this does work, just allowing that to become an emergent property of your organization. And the last technique I want to talk about is think big, start small. So I think in government, we're quite used to seeing everything as needing like a massive program to do things, right? And that comes from, I think, aspects of how we fund technology that we're stuck with. For example, I think a great way to have something funded is to be seen as the solution to a problem. And then suddenly you go from having no funding for your problem, for your solution, to lots and lots of funding, more than you can even spend. Rarely is it sort of like, rarely is it the case that that we're able to perfectly line up when we want to do something and the effort we want to put into it. Like we find ourselves in these programs. And if you do find yourself in that situation, definitely keep the ambitions massive, right? So you really do want to see something like 95% of your team effort going into value add over routine maintenance. And you really do want to see something like outstanding feedback from your users and citizens. But you really, really want to challenge how you're going to measure that early on. So, for example, let's say that your overall goal is to reduce manual caseload in a system by 75% year on year. So the number of times a human has to come and intervene in the case versus it being done automatically. Well, instead of that, can we start by asking, how fast can we decrease this thing by 5%? Or how fast can we decrease this by 1%? Or even how fast can we decrease this by a single case, right? Could we do that in a day or 2 days? And the reason for this is that your plan is wrong, right? So the plan that you came up with at the start of this large program is not going to be the right plan to get you where you want to be. And you want to learn how it's wrong as early as possible. But on top of that, something that's that most people that have worked in digital for a while notice is that small positive effects aren't linear, they compound. And I was chatting to Dave Rogers, if anyone knows him, and he used this analogy of a freezer to me, where it's sort of like, you start off, if you're defrosting the freezer, you start off by chipping off like little bits of ice, and there's a bit coming off here and then. But then eventually, just like the whole block of ice just falls down, right, as it starts melting and you're chipping away as you go. And it's a similar thing in tech. So if you've worked on a digital team, you've probably seen this, where your team, like, it's really struggling to get one thing over the line. But then as soon as it does that, all of the similar things just seem to be solving themselves. And that's what I mean by those effects compounding. It's also really important not to underestimate the effect of your teams getting to experience a victory, to experience a win. Even in the best of scenarios, working on legacy can be a demoralizing thing for your teams, right? And if you don't have leaders who can kind of tell the team, well, amongst all the chaos that we're causing, what are the important things that are going to remain constant? What's our mission? And how do we connect to those important things? And if you find yourself having to be one of those leaders, one of the most powerful things you can do is let your team experience a win, right? To say, yes, we're working towards this sort of 2-year goal or whatever, but this is what we did today, right? This is our evidence to know that we're on the right track. So what's the takeaway here? What am I saying? Am I saying that if you do these 4 things, right, like you run these 4 workshops, use these 4 techniques, and only these 4 things, then every time you modernize, you're going to do a great job? No, right? So if it was that easy, I would be out of a job. But these are techniques that are a small illustrative subset of what your teams should be doing at the same time as they're thinking about that technology. Your teams have to be deeply examining, challenging, and overturning those legacy decisions if you want, in all of the spaces on the left, right? All of the levers to our modernization that we have, that you spoke about at the start. If you want to be building tech that's going to be fundamentally different from the thing that you're currently stuck with, that this isn't an optional step of the process. By making sure that you split your team's attention across those things, you've got a much better chance of really getting to grips with how do we fix our legacy decision-making process and not just swap out some tools. So thank you. I'm going to hand over back to Jack to start the Q&A and turn that fan back on because I am melting.
Thank you very much, Tito. That's perfect timing for our Q&A. We can start with our first question. Where can we find more information on other useful workshops that we can run?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So my go-to is Twitter. If you're following, especially people like Simon Wardley on Twitter, and just the interactions he's having, often that, you're probably not going to get like a prepackaged, here's the steps to run this workshop, but what you will get is, here's a way to look at your problem and categorize your problem. And you're going to have to do a bit of designing for your workshop around that. And, I guess you should probably do that anyway, because nobody knows your team and your context better than you do. But Twitter's definitely my go-to. Start with Simon Wardley. Just look at the people tweeting at him and his replies to tweets. That's a good start.
Lovely stuff. Next question. Who should we invite to our hypothesis workshop? Would it be everyone in the department, team up to senior stakeholders? Do technical teams need to be in these sessions?
Yes, so absolutely all of those people need to be involved. So this is about the hypothesis workshop specifically.
Yeah, that's what we have written here, yes.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, those people all absolutely need to be involved for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because you know some of the probabilities and they know some of the probabilities, right? So in terms of stuff like, you could go left to right and build a hypothesis that if each of those things happened, then it would meet your goal, but it won't happen, right? So let's say we replaced one of those with, in our worked example, I go to sell my house. I use the new AI system. I just tell it what I want and it does everything for me. And then, the assessment gets done. Well, yeah, that would solve your problem, but it's not going to happen. So you need digital people in to give you that kind of realism. And you also need non-digital people in to think about, well, who are the people we're talking about, and who currently uses this service, who complains, right? What are the big issues that I've had to deal with? All of those things give them a feeling for that probability. And the last reason why you want more senior people there too is because they're the ones that need to accept this idea that you're going to have this these tiers of risk across the things that you're tackling, and who you want to build a shared risk profile with to say, is it so bad if we risk this thing versus this thing? Having them there and experiencing just the impact of putting that together collaboratively, I think goes a long way to making that a more realistic chat about risk.
Cool. Our next question is, any successful strategies for helping demonstrate this approach to leaders who tend to lean on technology and tool choices to fix problems, which needs to be addressed via team structure and strategy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I suppose the one thing you can't control is like the the quality of executive decision making in your organization, right? So it might well be the case that people just disagree with you. And in that case, there's not a huge amount you can do. In terms of like, if you wanted to persuade them, maybe. So if you wanted to say, hey, this is what you're doing. This is the things that are missing. I think talking about how things have gone wrong in your current system is usually quite powerful. So there's a reason why people are willing to spend money on this thing, right? There's a reason why suddenly we're saying, how do we modernize this? Why is it this that they're talking about that for? And those reasons themselves, if you can find a way to link that effect, that bad effect you're trying to counter, to some aspect of the system that's not just tech, well, that's quite a powerful argument, right? So let's say a system went down and it got in the press and people couldn't do their jobs for a few days or something like that. Well, can you point to other organizations who, yes, they're using this weird 20-year-old technology, but their systems don't break every 2 months, right? Or can you point to the direct cause of this thing? Like, was it, why didn't we catch that error in advance? Is that literally because of the technology? Or is that because not one person or not one team has access to all the bits of data? So I'd really try and work through those past examples. And you might even learn from that. You don't need to fix the thing at all. Maybe it's actually good enough legacy, and that's a nice thing to learn too.
Next question. Do you have any recommendations for reading / resources? Oh, sorry, jumped. / resources on changing the mindset around legacy things, changing the, I know it's difficult, but I've learned how to use it, so why change?
Yeah, so my recommendation here is a lot more abstract and is not really about tech at all. So sorry if that's not what you're looking for. But my recommendation is a book called The Birth of the Chaotic Age. And that's by Dee Hock, the founder of Visa. And he just talks about more in the more abstract sense. What do you need to do to set up your organization to exist where the comms you need require this weird balance of chaos and order? And a lot of the way that I started thinking about organizations came from that book, but it doesn't talk about tech specifically.
Lovely. Next question. What excites you most about avoiding the legacy trap? How have you seen this resonate on an emotional level with decision makers and agile teams?
Yeah, so I think that most people want to solve problems for their users, and I think that's why they stick around, especially in the public sector. And being able to sort of say, well, not like, oh, what we're doing at the moment is swapping out this kind of table for this kind of table, but being able to provide the leadership to say, no, what we're doing is we're giving ourselves control over this process and speed over this process, so that over the next 2 years, we can do this, this, and this for our users that we couldn't do before. I think that's a pretty strong motivation for people who, especially people who've chosen to work in public service.
Cool. Our next question. I like the definitions of legacy systems. Can you expand on that one, on any system without automated testing solutions?
Yeah, so this comes from, oh gosh, I can't remember the book, but it's a book by Michael Feathers. I think his first name is Michael. His surname is certainly Feathers, which is working with the legacy code or something similar, where he talks about, he opens the book by saying that's his definition of legacy, and he acknowledges that it's probably a controversial one. But what he's trying to get across is that that's where your legacy is in terms of code, because that's the thing that it's not under control, right? So like, it's not literal age we care about when we're thinking about code. You can, I guess I could write a function today and it would be terrible, and people would probably say, oh, that's legacy. Even if it was brand new, they might say that. Or there could be something written by someone better than me last year, which is still perfectly accurate. And I think what I'm trying to get across is that tests are the big factor there, right? Because you can change it and you can iterate and you can control safely. So yeah, I started with that. And I've heard a lot of kind of people from the extreme programming community talk about that. But I really wanted to zoom out and think about systems and not just code.
How do we escape the trap of vendors who have locked us into legacy services so that we can focus on taking the journey on our own terms?
That's a really good question. So I suppose there's a few things there's two sides to this question. So the first side is if you're talking about procuring a system, I think there it's all about open data. So the thing that you're procuring is the data that it generates. Is that in some open standard format, or is it some weird thing that only this system understands? And the same with the interfaces, right? So is it communicating with the rest of your estate in some open, repeatable way that other things could pick up on the future, or is it doing something wild that only it knows? So if you're talking about procurement, that's of a system. I'd focus on those things. If you're talking about like getting a vendor to come in and help you build software, then I think it's reasonable to ask them to build this into the outcomes that they intend to sell you, right? So don't just say we want to contract this for that we've got, I don't know, a Ruby system with a Postgres database or something like that. But talk to them about, well, actually, can the outcome for this be that yes, we've got this modern system and it is run by civil servants, right? Or run by contractors or employees of the local authority or of the local health board, or whatever your run model is, build that right in and say to them, like, look, this is what we want, like make your tech choices based on us being able to hire, and this is how we hire. I think most good vendors of custom software would be happy with that.
Lovely. I think we've got time for one last question. How do we get people across our organization agreeing on what we mean by the label legacy?
So I guess firstly, so do you need them to agree on what we mean by the label, or just what is legacy? Where is the legacy? And I think it's probably a bit of both. So if you're talking about you've got some people maybe in leadership positions, some people in operational positions, some people in digital positions, and can you get them all to agree? I guess I wouldn't be trying to focus so much on look across the whole estate and think about, well, this thing, is it legacy or is it not legacy? And maybe try and flip it a bit and think about what's our pressing problem. And let's call that, as long as we call that legacy, I guess we don't really mind if the rest of the stuff gets in or not, right? So I try and think about it pragmatically in that way. And if you end up in a conversation with somebody about is this legacy or is this not legacy, I think at that point the label has outserved its usefulness, and instead just switch the conversation and say like, okay, never mind, like whatever, it might be legacy, it might not be. Can we talk about, is it easy to change? Is it supported? Is it expensive? All of those factors. Does it look good in our CVs? All of those factors instead. That's probably going to be a more productive conversation.
Lovely stuff. All right. Well, I think that's about enough time for us to wrap up. Just want to open by saying a huge thank you to Tito for making time to speak to us all today. And I'm just going to share my screen very quickly. And secondly, a huge thank you to all of you for making some time in your day to attend. We really appreciate it. First things first, we're going to be sending everyone who attended the webinar today a feedback form. It takes about 1 minute to fill out and goes a really long way for helping us improve our topics and future events. We'd also like to announce our next webinar coming out on the 26th of August with our very own senior engineer in Bristol, Scott Edwards, who's going to be talking about how to upskill your technical teams effectively. Also like to mention our new ebook launch coming out tomorrow on our website. We'll be sending out information to our attendees on how to get their own copy. That should be coming out on our website tomorrow if you want to learn a little bit more about what we've been talking about today in terms of modernizing legacy applications in the public sector. If you want to reach out to Tito about how what we've spoken about today can apply to your own business, socials are up on the screen, or if you just want to stay in touch and keep in the loop on all things Maytech, our details are up on the screen. Please feel free to reach out to Tito, very active on Twitter, and we'll be keen to answer any of your questions if you didn't get them answered during the Q&A. And without much further ado, I'd just like to say have a lovely afternoon and take care. Thank you very much. And thank you, Tito.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.